Hello everyone and welcome once again to The View from the Midwest. It's time for another Bleedin' Blue edition of our look at the NHL Central. So let's get right into things, and we'll start things off as we normally do with the Dallas Stars. And the Dallas Stars went crashing out in the second round to the St. Louis Blues in 7 games. Dallas had a hard-fought series overall, but obviously lost it by a margin of 4-3, forcing a Game 7. Dallas won 3-2 on Monday, as I mentioned, forcing that Game 7, and that game was in St. Louis, and it was an all-important matchup, and Dallas thought that they were going to have some momentum carry over because Kari Lehtonen really kind of held on to that game for the Stars. The Stars went up 3-0 right off the bat in that one very quickly. It was almost bang-bang. In fact, the first 2 goals were scored only seconds apart, really. And then the third goal came on the power play later in the first period. St. Louis managed to try to come back in that one, but it was not to be, as Kari Lehtonen, as I mentioned, pretty much won that game for the Dallas Stars. Then go on to Game 7 in Dallas. You would think that the Stars would come out rearing, rip-roaring, and ready to go, and it just wasn't the case as they fell by the final score of 6-1 in Game 7 to the St. Louis Blues. Obviously, the St. Louis Blues going on to the Western Conference semifinals, or excuse me, the Western Conference Finals, and Dallas is left to kind of ponder what could have been. Dallas got goals from Spezza, Fiddler, Janmark, and Eves this past week, and unfortunately it just wasn't enough for them to get on to the Western Conference Finals. Now, one of the big things for Dallas going into the offseason is going to be their goaltending situation. Personally, I don't think either Lehtonen or Niemi are that bad. Obviously, Niemi's even won a Stanley Cup. He won with the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, the Dallas Stars are not quite as talented as Chicago was in that year, but they're getting there. They need a few more defensive pieces. So, could they go with Niemi? That is a question that only they can answer right now. But Lehtonen has been solid in his career. He just hasn't necessarily been given the opportunity to flourish in the playoffs yet. And for all we know, he could be the next Brian Elliott because as Brian Elliott has proved this year, he has been solid. He has been one of the main reasons the St. Louis Blues have gone as far as they have. So how do we know that Lehtonen isn't going to become that in the future? Because Elliott was not that solid earlier in his career. He had a lot of postseason failings. Now, a lot of people who are apologists for him say, well, he was never given the official chance, never given a good opportunity. Well, sometimes you have to make your own opportunity, and up until this year, he did not. And it was quite justifiable that he wasn't in the net in some of those other places, and when he was, he didn't necessarily flourish either. But Lehtonen could do that as well, because we've seen his capabilities of trying to steal games, and he just didn't come up with that, whether or not he was just looking over his shoulder too much, thinking that Niemi was always going to be put in if he made any kind of mistake. Some goaltenders do very well if they're pushed from behind, some do not, and perhaps that might have been the situation that the Dallas Stars ran into, that they kind of had 2 goaltenders who didn't necessarily get that good push from the person that was sitting next to them in the locker room. One of the other big questions, obviously, from the goaltending standpoint is, can you really justify putting $10 million into one position? The St. Louis Blues have 2 of the best goaltenders in the league, not necessarily from a famous standpoint. You go around the league and ask people who Brian Elliott and Jake Allen are, not everybody's going to know. But on the flip side of that, the St. Louis Blues still have decent amount of cost effectiveness at that position. They have 2 quality goaltenders, and both of them combined are only costing them a little over $4 million, whereas Dallas has 2 decent goaltenders, and they're paying $10 million overall. So that's going to be an interesting key for their offseason. Moving right along, though, the Nashville Predators crashed out in 7 games as well as they fell to the San Jose Sharks. The Predators won Game 6 by coming from behind. They fell behind in period 1, but the first frame would end up 2-1. San Jose would score in the second, and then Nashville would come back in the third, and they would end up winning in overtime on Monday by a final score of 4-3, and then they ended up losing Game 7 all the way on Thursday. Perhaps a bit too much of a gap there for Nashville, but they also didn't win a game all series in San Jose either. So a combination of factors there, and they ended up putting up a goose egg on the board. 5-0 was the final there. And they got goals during the week from Colin Wilson, Arvidsson, Johansson, and Josi. And Pekka Rinne just was not Pekka Rinne that we have all come to know. He let up 5 goals on 26 shots, had a bit of an Ed Belfour moment towards the end of the game there, understandably so. He was frustrated with the defensive help that he got, but probably more so his own play as well. And he will look to bounce back next season as well. But it was just kind of an interesting situation because as a Blues fan, I kept telling people that were friends or relations that going into the Western Conference Finals as a team, I would have rather have played Nashville because San Jose just matches up very well with the St. Louis Blues. As a goaltender, I would rather play Nashville because Pekka Rinne has been a thorn in the St. Louis Blues side for a long time, and for whatever reason, he just couldn't necessarily get that going consistently against the San Jose Sharks. He made unbelievable saves. There's a save that they keep playing on one of the NBC highlight reels where he just gets over on his stomach, gets his toe over, makes the save, and then kicks it away from the post. So the guy is just unbelievably talented, but he couldn't summon that talent when it was needed every single time against the San Jose Sharks. And a lot of credit has to go to the San Jose Sharks. It's not as though Pekka Rinne lost this series by any means, any way, shape, or form, but you expect somebody of his caliber to necessarily be able to win you the series, and in Game 7 that just necessarily wasn't the case for Nashville, so they go home a little bit disappointed. The St. Louis Blues obviously are playing in the Western Conference Finals against the San Jose Sharks. They've played 3 games over the past week. They lost 3-2 to the Dallas Stars way back on Monday, then won 6-1, dominating Game 7 against Dallas to go to the conference finals. And then a combination, admittedly, even as a Blues fan, I have to put it out there, St. Louis was lucky, and a combination of that with Brian Elliott's play won them Game 1 over San Jose by the score of 2-1. You can get all the official stats for the players on the St. Louis Blues over the past week on the article on bleedandblue.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're on the article, obviously you've probably already read them. Moving right along, the St. Louis Blues going forward are really going to need consistent effort by all 4 of their lines. You can't necessarily start playing only 3 lines, and unfortunately I kind of think that is going to preclude playing somebody like Ryan Reeves, simply because you look at some of his ice time that he's been on the ice in games past when he's been in there. You love his physicality, you love the energy that he brings to the game. But if Ken Hitchcock, and Reed Lowe said this same thing on the radio earlier today, if Ken Hitchcock is hesitant to put Ryan Reeves out there, and he's only going to see 2 or 3 minutes of ice time, then he doesn't need to be in the lineup. I like Ryan Reeves. I don't think he necessarily detracts anything. Obviously, he's not going to score you any goals very often, and perhaps that's the hesitance of putting him out there because he detracts something offensively. But overall, if that is the amount of ice time that he is going to see, then he shouldn't see any time in this series, simply because you need your 4th line to get between 10 and 12 minutes of ice time just to give a bit of a breather to everybody else and still contribute, maybe chip in a goal here or there, but not necessarily make any kind of mistake that's going to put you in the box, because St. Louis cannot be in the penalty box for very often. They are not going to hold off the San Jose power play forever in this series. They did a good job in Game 1. We'll see how that pans out over the next week. But right now, they need to stay out of the box. Ryan Reeves plays with a bit of an edge. So does Steve Ott. So I almost wonder if they go with Dmitry Yaskin, get him a little bit more acclimated on the defensive side, and then you also get the opportunity to score some goals as well. But he is young. You don't necessarily want him playing in any kind of uncomfortable situations where he could be exposed either. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see what Coach Hitchcock goes with going forward. But that's the look at the previous week for the St. Louis Blues and the NHL Central. The St. Louis Blues are obviously the only team remaining in the division. We're going to keep these videos going as long as the playoffs are going and possibly into the off season as well. So if there are any stories going on with NHL Central teams, obviously it would be mainly rumors because you can't make any off season moves yet in terms of player movement. You could re-sign somebody, so if we have anybody that does anything like that, we'll go ahead and involve this and let you know. But until the next time, comment, rate, and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time, and until the next time, I'll see you then.